did just come from San Quentin, and I've had I was out of the country for 3.5 weeks when we were exchanging a lot of emails about this, and I got a little behind. And then since I've been home, it's been quite an action-packed couple of weeks. And as I was leaving San Quentin, I got stopped by the warden on the way out, which is
not a bad thing.
It turned out not to be, but you never know. Okay, you never know. And so, yeah, so I'm feeling a little not quite as settled as usual, but I thought I would talk a bit about what I've done in the criminal justice system, because often when people want me to talk, it's because I have touched on so many different areas of the criminal justice system. Probably the most popular question I get, definitely the most popular question that I get on a very regular basis is, how did you fall into doing what it is you do? And the next most popular question is always, what exactly is it that you do? And so, as Mary said, I started out in the criminal justice system. My first job in criminal justice, I was still in college. And I was thinking about being a lawyer, going to law school at some point. And because that's what everyone had always told me that I should do. Probably I was kind of a mouthy kid, and so they thought that would be a good fit. I went to work for an attorney, and I'm from the deep South. I grew up outside Mobile, Alabama, in a town called Chickasaw, Alabama. And I got a job with an attorney in Mobile, and his investigator didn't show up to work one day, and we had a pretty high-profile murder case. And the attorney that I worked with was pretty green as well. He had just recently passed the bar after his 7th attempt at passing. And I realize now, I was thinking about this today as I was driving over, our combined ages at the time is less than my age now. So we were both young and didn't know what we were doing. And we had this pretty high profile murder case. And we got to the courthouse, and somehow I get stuck in the room with the state's star witness. And the attorney says, ask him some questions, talk to the witnesses. Okay, I don't really know, I don't have any idea what I'm doing. So I sat down and I started talking to this guy who said was a state star witness. And within a few minutes, he confessed that he made the whole story up. He'd been lying about what happened. And that was an admission that saved our client from what was likely going to be at least a life sentence, right? And perhaps a death sentence, because that case got so much attention. And he went home within a week or two with unserved. And it was my first understanding of how quickly things can go really, really wrong. And this young man, our client, had an IQ of 58. And understanding that no one talked to him, no one had someone who could talk to him, who was specialized, who was trained to talk to somebody about a crime, someone who was young and had an IQ of 58. And that was sobering. And then maybe a month or two later, I picked up a copy of a book called Circumstantial Evidence. And it was about the Walter McMillan case. And a lot of folks have now heard about the Walter McMillan case because it was an attorney who wasn't very well known then, but is now Brian Stevenson, has gone on to do quite a bunch of other things, and wrote Just Mercy and has done some other really awesome things. But at the time, nobody was really aware of this case, this man. And I was reading the book, and I was already working in this lawyer's office in the Deep South, and the Walter McMillan case. Walter, the black man in Monroeville, Alabama, which is where Harper Lee was born. It's the real life setting of To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was reading this book, and I had a lot of family in Monroeville. The victim in that crime was a young white girl, not much older than myself, and reading about this story at the same time that I was working in the legal field in Mobile, just across the bay. I knew a lot of the people involved in the case that I was reading about, but I had come to know them in a different way. You know, there was somebody who dropped a comp pie off at the office, or so and so's best friend played golf with that one, and reading about their part in this case, this travesty of justice, was also very sobering. I learned a lot about sometimes injustice is born out of all kinds of the ills that we hear about and talk about a lot, and then sometimes it's just laziness, but I realize in this kind of work in criminal justice, somebody not doing their job could cost someone their life, right? And whether they were not doing their job because they had a bias, or just not doing their job because they didn't take the time to educate themselves, was definitely a big part of my sort of jumping off into this work. Walter McMillan was sentenced to death, and then Brad Stevenson exonerated him. And I think learning about that case in conjunction with everything else, one of the other things that I learned from that case, at the time, Alabama was one of 2 states where a judge could override a jury's decision. And that's what happened in this case, and it happened over 100 times in Alabama's history, where a judge overrode a jury's decision. And so the jury found him that he deserved a life sentence, and the judge overrode this and single-handedly handed down the death sentence. And so I knew a lot of those judges, and that judge's name was Robert E. Lee Key. And so and that was his real name, and he didn't choose to go by something else. And he became a grown man and was in a in a position of power over people. So I knew then that I wanted to work in criminal justice, but I really felt a pull to working in post-conviction. I really wanted to work with people who had already been in the system, had gotten the short end of the stick for whatever reason, whether that was innocence cases or people who had been sentenced to death. That's what I really wanted to do. And so I took a bit of a break from criminal defense and worked suing CDCR and suing prison systems. And there's a lot of California cases that I worked on that were really great precedent. Clark, Armstrong, that set standards for incarcerated people with developmental disabilities or medical disabilities. And I heard some really, really horrific stories in that work. At one point, my job in that work was a bit of a compliance officer. There had already been some court orders come down, and the prison system had to comply with what the court had said around treatment. And then on some cases, I was the investigator that went in and got the original stories for the lawsuits. And I heard stories like, a deaf prisoner not being given an interpreter at his parole hearing, a prisoner who was in a wheelchair, whose parole hearing was on the 4th floor, not being given any access to get upstairs to his parole hearing. So he crawled, but missed half of his hearing accordingly. I talked to one woman who her arm was broken. She was an orderly, and she was cleaning the bathroom, and she slipped and fell and broke her arm. And at the prison, she was told she was whining, toughen up. And she kept complaining about it because she had a broken arm, and you could tell it was broken. And no one took the time to even do an X-ray, but you really didn't have to do an X-ray, just look at her arm until it was broken. And so they got mad and retaliated and gave her a job cutting grass with a push mower, right? And she eventually had bone cancer set in at the break point. These were the kinds of this was what life in California prisons was like at that time. We'll talk soon a bit more about what I'm doing now, which is much more hopeful than all of these really tragic stories. But I then went from that work that I really wanted to do post-conviction legal work, and an opening came up at the Habeas Corpus Resource Center, which only works on death penalty cases, people who've already been sentenced to death. And so I did that for 5 or 6 years and did the investigation of that case, but I eventually segued into what's called a mitigation specialist, which is what led me to the work that I'm doing now. It's been a winding journey. As a mitigation specialist, so a capital trial has 2 phases. And sorry if I'm repeating some stuff you might have heard from some of the other speakers, but or that you just already know. But so death penalty capital trial has 2 phases. The first is just your typical law and order trial that you see on TV. And then if the defendant is found guilty, that same jury that just heard all this evidence and found someone guilty of a heinous crime, that same jury comes back in and is asked to either spare the person's life and give them life without the possibility of parole or a death sentence. And what should happen is the defense should offer what's called mitigation evidence, and the prosecution offers aggravation evidence. And the mitigation, so the trial shouldn't be on the table at all anymore, right? You've already found the guy guilty of this, or the woman guilty of what they came to trial for. That's all that should be happening at the penalty phase, but that's never the way it goes. The prosecution has, just by virtue of their job, been collecting aggravation evidence against this person for the whole time since the crime happened, right? It might be months after the crime happens before the defendant gets a defense attorney. The prosecution and the DA's office, they've been on this from jump, right? And then everything that they've been collecting is aggravation evidence. And so by the time they get to the penalty phase, they've got mountains of aggravation evidence to bring in. Every piece of candy the defendant ever stole as a child is going to come into the courtroom. The defense attorney, on the other hand, probably has no idea how to do mitigation investigation, because that's not what they've been trained to do. They've been going and saying my client is innocent, and then if suddenly it's like, oh, I have someone who's already determined guilty, I got to tell you why he did it, not that he didn't do it. Where do I even start? It's an entirely different kind of investigation. And you also have a situation where the homicide team in the DA's office, this is pretty much the only kinds of cases that they handle. They've got all these resources, and it's what they do day in and day out. The majority of defense attorneys on capital cases, it might be their only capital trial of their careers. Maybe they'll have a couple. More likely they got appointed to it. Often they didn't want it. They don't want any part of this case, and they don't have any kind of understanding about what led their client to commit a murder, and no way of starting at that point to go back and unearth all that trauma and kind of figure out what that's about. So, in the state of California, if someone ends up on death row, then they get an appellate attorney, and they eventually get a habeas attorney, and that's what I did for a long time, Habeas Corpus Resource Center. Once they get habeas representation, it's really the first time that a defendant can offer new evidence. Appeals are really on the record, right? So if it's on paper, then you have something to work with. If there was a constitutional error, you have something to work with in that appellate phase. But new evidence is hard to get in until you get to the habeas phase. And that's when their files will come across my desk. But I was seeing their cases 25, 30 years after the crime. Crime scene might not even exist at all. The witnesses might not be alive anymore. It's an entirely different situation. So you would think that kind of investigation would be made available to someone when they're at trial in the first place, but it's not really. And ironically, it became available after 30 years after they've been sentenced to death, in some ways of trying to speed up the death penalty. But at a minimum, at least in California, defendants do get this representation. And a lot of people have been found innocent. Vicente Benavidez, who went home 6 months ago or so from death row, was found innocent. He was a client of our center. But even if the innocence is not at play, often how these cases are won is on how you get the death sentence overturned, not somebody going home, but the death sentence overturned, is what's called ineffective assistance of counsel, because they had attorneys who didn't know what they were doing. All right, and I would come in now 25, 30 years later and do the mitigation investigation. So I would talk to parents, school teachers, I would go to full social services records, really create a social history as far back as I could for my client. So again, not saying what happened, what crime happened, what might happen. So I'm trying to paint a picture for the court why this happened, why this individual committed this crime. And that radically sort of changed my understanding of victims. So many of my cases are unlike what you saw on the news. Often in my cases, people were from the same neighborhood, were from the same income level, were sometimes from the same families. Right? And the cases I was seeing on the news didn't reflect that. The victims often look like me, but the person who had committed the harm often did not, right? And so there was this that really kind of stuck with me. But then now in more than 200 cases, I have not had a single one where my client wasn't a victim first. And I had a single case where I didn't dig deep enough, and oftentimes you don't have to dig deep at all, to find extraordinary trauma in the lives of my clients. And maybe one or two that were in foster care at some point, didn't have a social services record, just extraordinary abuse. Some clients still physically, you could see the marks of the abuse as when they were adults. I had one client whose father began, who had some military PTSD, began kicking him in the head when he was a toddler, while he still had the dad still had out in steel-toe boots, and you could still see, dents in the forehead. And so you can literally look at this guy and know he's got some frontal lobe damage, but it wasn't anything that was presented during his original trial. So case after case after case after case after case, and the first case, it's like, oh, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary amount of trauma and abuse. And 200 later, even 10 or 12, I started thinking, this isn't extraordinary. Oh, it's common. This is a common thread. This is what paves the path to death row. So I did that work for 5 or 6 years, and then went and started doing investigation work sort of more generally. And I was asked to join the board of directors of Inside Prison Project. And so I joined the board of directors, and the prison wouldn't let me in because I sued them a lot, and either on behalf of individual clients who were on the road, and before that I did the prisoners' rights cases. And so I was the board. I was on the board, and then I was the chair of the board of an organization doing work in prison, and the prison said I couldn't come in. So I enlisted some legislative help and some friends, and eventually the prison said let me in, and I started going in. And I was allowed to go in for long enough that I built some friendships with people who made those kinds of decisions, and they started letting me go in more and more and do a little bit more. And then IDB needed an executive director. The previous one stepped down, and I stepped in as interim, and it was going to be interim. I had every intention that it was going to be 3 to 6 months. And that turned into 3 to 5 years. And but it ended up being something I really, really enjoyed, and I liked it, and we were doing well, and we were expanding really, really quickly. I think we moved from 10 prisons to now 25, very, very quickly. But we're also getting the budget to increasing the budget to be able to do higher quality work. And also at that time, we had a participant in one of our programs come out in a male prison, which doesn't happen very often. And that led us to establish an LGBTQ class at San Quentin. And me being the only LGBTQ person on staff, that one ended up being my baby. So I helped for the last couple of years write that curriculum and kind of get it off the ground, and it's has done some really, really amazing things. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more too. But one of the more interesting things is that after not letting me into the prison for all that time, and now letting me in to have an LGBTQ class, right? The administration recently came to me and asked me to take that class to death row, and death row doesn't have any other classes, right? So it's been a pretty full circle in the last few months of starting out with the death row work in California, not being allowed in the prison, didn't have an LGBTQ class, and now they're letting me take it to death row. So that has been really, really cool. And probably the coolest thing recently is that there's a young man who helped me establish that program in the prison, who actually had a bit of an anti-lesbian underpinning to his crime. It wasn't a hate crime, but he's from Sacramento. His dad was a pretty involved and high up drug dealer. Dad got stabbed, and the drug deal gone bad. Oldest son's responsibility to go vindicate that. He's like the nicest guy in the world, and you can I can like see in him that he was struggling with this idea of having to go harm someone. He says that if I knew him at the time, I wouldn't think he was the nicest guy in the world, but which is probably right, because he decided, that he had to do what he was, his responsibility. And he was struggling with it until he heard that it was a man and a woman, until he heard that the woman was a lesbian, and he said that he used that difference to dehumanize her, and thought, oh, well, I can think less of her, and hurting a human being would be too hard. So now I have the strength to go do this. And he busted in the door of the house where the people were not, and but there was a gun battle that ensued. 2 people ended up dead, and so he was facing a death sentence. And was in the hole in Sac County Jail for a week while they decided whether or not to charge him with a capital trial. He ended up not doing it, so he went to trial, and he got 61 years to life. So he should not have been eligible for parole for another 42 years when SB 262 was passed. and this is a youthful offender legislation. There was a legislation passed. The first bill was SB Senate Bill 260, which said anyone who committed a crime at 18 years or younger can have a life sentence. The parole board has to give great weight to their age at the time of the crime. Well, brain science says the frontal cortex and your decision making isn't really fully developed until you're 25. So they kept stepping up the bill, and SB 260 said 23 and under, and then AB 1308 made it 25 and under. He was 19 when he committed his crime, so he got a chance to go to the parole board, and I didn't have much hope that he was going to be successful, much less his first time at the parole board with a double murder. But he was. He came home the day of Insight Prison Project's fundraiser and went from the prison to the fundraiser to start giving back right away, and he has continued to do that. What I was sort of doing on the side of all this was trying to end the death penalty and executions in California. And I had founded a group that was existed to inspire and educate and give either the last governor or the current governor all of the information that he might need to do to ensure there are no more executions in California. And I thought it was going to work with the last governor. We had done we'd gotten like a lot of really good information out. We got the 6 governors of other states who had done that to write an op-ed to the New York Times. We had a ton of information out there. I think the Pope called him. Sister Helen wrote a lovely letter. We had ministers of justice from all over the world. I think we got every newspaper in at least in Northern California. I think all the major newspapers in California wrote an op-ed calling on him to do it, and I thought he was going to do it, but he didn't do it. But then Newsom came in and did it, and that was just I was out of the country on Monday of that week, and then came home. I was driving to my Tuesday on death row and got the call that that decision was coming down, and that it was going to happen the next day on Wednesday, and that I could go to be at the governor's office that day when it was all happening, and that I could bring the +1, and my +1 ended up being this guy Phil who helped me create that program. We had this a very different mindset at 19 when he busted in the door of somebody he thought was a lesbian, and then helped me create and help me write the curriculum and do so much of the work for the LGBTQ class at San Quentin. So it was cool. I have a picture that this is Phil. I just came out of the office as I was leaving, and they had printed it out and had it up there. I was like, I'm gonna take that and borrow it for a minute. And so this is Phil, and he. So it was just really cool that somebody was there to take this picture, because this is the guy who really kickstarted my marriage equality and ended executions. This guy was almost executed, and then helped build the equity and LGBTQ class and something. Yeah, sure. So I know that is like a lot of information, and I haven't even mentioned the word restorative justice yet. But I don't really consider myself an expert in restorative justice. I'm a nonprofit executive and a founder of things, and so I would kind of come in and kind of establish these things. And what they called me at HDRC was a firefighter, like when something's in trouble, then kind of come in and fix things. And that's how I kind of ended up in restorative justice. Which we're really kind of trying to segue even that terminology a little bit into more transformational justice. There's a lot I have learned, but in prison, often if you say restorative justice, they're like, well, what are you restoring, really? They just told you about all the trauma that paves the path to prison, and so restoration isn't really how folks on the inside look at this. But transformation is something I think we can all use a little bit more of. But what I think I really wanted to point out is like how all of these things support one another, the intersections of these movements. I also worked with the Innocence Project and on the Angola 3 case for a long time. The Angola 3 case, they did, I don't know if you know, that guys know that they did 44 years of solitary confinement in Angola prison in Louisiana. And on that case, I was working on it as an investigator pro bono, and decided that I wanted to go talk to the widow of the victim, and everyone told me that I was crazy because the victim was a prison guard. Murder happened in Angola prison, and Angola prison is a former slave plantation, and even worse, and just something that was, working on it for 20 years, still gets stuck on my throat even saying it. It's a slave breeding farm. And it was owned by the wealthiest slave breeders in the country. And they owned a bunch of plantations. And after the Civil War, one of the owners wanted to get rid of this plantation, and it was sold to a Confederate soldier, Confederate captain, colonel, and he decided that he would transition it into a prison because post the Emancipation Proclamation, it really changed the prison system because there were a few county jails, mostly dealing with white people. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation and punishment for people of color being left up to the state, jails filled up really quickly, and there was no place to house them. And also Louisiana and most of the South was broke from the war. So their solution was to rent out the prisoners. So they rented out prisoners to do work for plantation owners. So it was still slavery. And eventually, this colonel got the lease for the entire prisoner population of Louisiana. He moved them to Angola, and literally worked hundreds and thousands of men and women and children to death because he paid one price for the lease, right? Unlike the slave owners had done, right? So he didn't have any reason to have any humanity. So it's and the reason that they named it Angola prison is because the legend at the time was that the strongest slaves came from Angola and Africa. So it was called Angola Plantation when it transitioned into a prison, and then eventually state-owned. They didn't change the name; it's still called Angola to this day. And what made Angola really interesting and awful is that it's so far out. It's out in the middle of nowhere, and I would even after they paved Angola Road, it still took me a couple of hours to get there from New Orleans. You just drive and drive and drive and drive, and so they couldn't find anybody to work there because it's so far out in the middle of nowhere. So they built a neighborhood inside the prison, and they built this neighborhood and gave people houses, and so they came with their spouses and their children, and they raised their children inside the prison. And I interviewed so many of the people who were raised there, and they thought it was like a big country club, and that's exactly how they would word it. It was like, this is a big country club. We got lakes, and we got horses, and we had a movie theater, and it's beautiful, good fishing, good hunting. In Angola, it's around on 3 sides of the Mississippi River, and so It's beautiful. You drive in and you think, it's more like driving into Southport than, driving into, I just dated myself there probably. Southport was the ranch on Dallas, which is still, that was on TV a long time ago. Yeah, so there was a guard there, and it was an all white employees for years, well into the 70s. And then Albert Woodbox and Herman Wallace and Robert King got there, all Black Panthers, who had learned some civil rights tactics from the outside and were trying to use them on the inside. And they were shaking up the system. And it was understood in that prison that there was a approval for the prisoners who were the toughest just to run things. There weren't a lot of guards, and they had these what they called trusty guards, and they gave them guns. They gave guards guns. They gave prisoners guns, and had a known sexual slavery ring at the prison. They knew that people were being traded, human beings were being traded, and it was brutal. And it's called the bloodiest prison in the nation. Exposés were written about it, but they never really, nothing really ever happened. And then these 3 Black Panthers come in, and they really start shaking up the system, and making some progress happen, and doing it in a non-violent way. And then a white guard ended up murdered, and they were like, well, clearly it was those guys, even though those guys were nowhere near. They all had alibis. There was a bloody fingerprint found at the crime scene. It didn't match either of these guys, but obviously it was him. Robert King actually wasn't even at the prison at the time. He was in a different prison, and so they decided it was these guys, and they threw them in solitary that day. And the first time I met them, they were still in solitary, and that was 32 or 34 years after the crime, which happened the year before I was born. And Robert just came home in 2016. I'm sorry, Albert just came home in 2016. Albert came home in 2015, and unfortunately, he was pretty sick, and he died 3 days later. But Albert's doing fantastic. He now has a book on the New York Times, so I think that it just dropped like last week. So
Solitary, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But in that case, it had enough of an understanding of we just decide for victims what they want and who they are. And I said, I'm going to talk to the widow, and I went to talk to the widow who thought it was crazy for showing up, and she also was raised in England. Okay? The only Black people she had ever met were prisoners. She was raised in this environment. She was raised at a prison that's named after a former slave plantation. So we were starting from very different places for sure. But she kept talking to me, and about a year or two in, she looked at me one day and she was like, "They're innocent, aren't they?" And from there, she traveled with me to DC and spoke to the Louisiana governor, the Judicial Council, the Judiciary Committee, and told them all that she believed these Black Panthers that she believed her whole life were militants and had killed the love of her life. Told them that they were innocent. And they've now all been able to meet each other and hang out together. She goes by Teeny. Her real name's Leontine. Teeny and Robert and Albert have all met and had an opportunity to talk to each other. And that's where I really started turning over this idea that the system doesn't work for anyone, right? Like, survivors aren't getting what they need. Incarcerated people, guilty or innocent, certainly if they're innocent, you know, I had so many clients that did 20, 30 years for crime they did not commit. These guys, you know, 44 years in solitary confinement for crime they didn't commit. But even if they're guilty, the recidivism rate in most places, you know, most states is 70% or more. So, so it's clearly not working. It's not making us safer if we're just churning out more crime and more trauma and more hurt. So yeah, working on that, and then kind of wrapping around and getting to go back into the prison and start really working with folks in the restorative justice model and in prison practice, what they call the victim offender education group, which will have a name change soon because, you know, we're always trying to improve language and no one would actually say offender anymore inside of the prison in these programs. But we haven't changed the name at this point because it's recognized by the Board of Parole, and they get quite a good bit of credit for participating in this program. And we don't want to give it a name that they don't recognize and end up having people stay in prison, you know, when they could be going home if we haven't changed the name. So I think particularly this has just really been on my mind in the last couple of weeks, you know, as I was staying with the governor and a guy who I thought would never leave prison, and all those intersections between the LGBTQ work that Gavin Newsom has done and that my friend Bill has done, innocence work that I was in that room with a number of exonerees that I knew, whose cases I worked on, and Gavin Newsom had also come in and sat in on these programs at San Quentin. And so he in fact, you'll see in that picture, Phil has his phone out. He's showing Gavin a photo of them, the two of them inside prison when he came into, and he was like, "Do you remember me?" And he's like showing a picture that the San Quentin News had taken. And so when it just really hit me, and you know, talking about full circle, it just kind of all went back to, you know, when I first got interested in this post-conviction work and people caught up in the system and the mass incarceration system, and realizing that it just everybody did their job, and it takes a village, and everybody's got to be paying attention, and you have to build off of one another. And I saw in that room, as we now have halted executions in California, and I believe we've seen the last one that we're ever going to see, as opposed to a few months before that being terrified about when they were about to start up again. And I know guys who were in that 25 who had exhausted appeals and who were on the short list. And just seeing a snapshot of what made that happen. And what made that happen was all of these different things, right? It was exonerees fighting for their freedom and to tell their story. It was guys who got life sentences as youth fighting to tell their stories. It was women in prison telling their stories. It was it was a lot of hard work, particularly these restorative justice and transformational justice programs are really, really hard. You know, I say all the time, it's like it's hard for people to admit like they were speeding, right? Or you get in an argument with your person, and it's just hard to take full accountability. It's just a difficult thing to do. To be particularly in a man's prison, and talk about not only all the worst things that you ever did, but all of the worst things that ever happened to you. That's typically in the men's prison, so it's even harder to talk about is the abuse. But they did that hard work, and then some of them were in that room with the governor as he ended executions, and just seeing the thread and the intersection of all of it, and knowing that each piece was really, really critical. And as Gavin Newsom told his stories about what it was that pushed him to do it so early on, and to have the death chamber actually dismantled and pulled out of San Quentin, physically pulled out. Every bit of this work that people, that activists and incarcerated people have been doing together for the last 20 years, a lot longer than that, but particularly in California for the last 20 years, there's been a lot of dedicated individuals collaborating, cross-fertilizing, their movements, so that it's I think it's really starting to raise all the boats, and it's being pretty obvious. So I can stop for a second and maybe take some questions, or I can tell you more about any one piece of this, or I can talk more about, very specifically about the programs that we have in the prison. But I felt like that overview was kind of timely for right now, particularly with everything that's going on.